They thought humiliating me in public would make me stay quiet again. What they did not know was that the chair they took from me was not the real issue. The real issue was the building, the signatures, and a lease they prayed I would never read line by line. By the time my father said, "It is just a chair. You can stand," I already knew exactly who was about to lose their place. My name is Sloane King, and I was exactly 6 weeks out from a spinal surgery that was supposed to keep me bedridden when I walked into the beautifully staged lie I had funded with my own money. The restored warehouse showroom in Ashburn Falls, Ohio, was a masterclass in atmospheric design. Warm, amber light spilled from dozens of oversized Edison bulbs suspended from the original wooden rafters. A live jazz trio occupied a corner stage, the rich notes of an upright bass vibrating through the polished concrete floor beneath my feet. Waitstaff wove seamlessly through the mingling crowds of local donors, investors, and elite clientele, carrying silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. It was a picture of absolute triumph, the highly anticipated anniversary and rebrand gala of the King family enterprise. I stood near the entrance, wrapped in a fitted black dress, tailored specifically to conceal the rigid, low-profile lumbar brace strapped tight across my midsection. Every movement I made was a calculated negotiation with my own nervous system. The doctors had been explicit about the severe risks of standing for prolonged periods. But I had forced myself here anyway. Through the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns, I located my one designated safe harbor, placed carefully near the edge of the staging area. Just to the left of the main podium was a single, high-backed, ergonomic chair. It was the only one of its kind in the room, clearly marked with a reserved tag. Just seeing it offered a phantom sense of relief. Across the room, my parents were performing their favorite roles. Denise and Martin King acted like polished, benevolent hosts who had pulled themselves up by their bootstraps to build this empire. Denise was laughing delicately, resting her hand on the forearm of a prominent local developer. Playing the part of the tireless visionary, Martin stood a few paces away, exuding the calm, commanding presence of a self-made patriarch. I watched them accept congratulations and toast to their own resilience. Not once did their eyes scan the room looking for me. Not once did they pause to wonder if the daughter who had coordinated the caterers, the lighting techs, and the floral installations from a recovery bed was standing in agony just 50 feet away. My physical pain, much like my quiet financial backing, was an inconvenient truth they preferred to ignore. The heavy oak doors at the front of the warehouse swung open, pulling a sudden draft through the room and signaling the arrival of the family golden boy. My younger brother, Travis King, never just entered a space. He announced himself to it. He was late, as always, but he wore his tardiness with an infuriating, loud overconfidence. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his voice booming over the subtle jazz music as he clapped a vendor on the shoulder. Trailing slightly behind him was a woman I had never met, his new girlfriend, Brooke Lane. She looked completely out of her depth, her eyes darting around the expansive, luxurious showroom. Travis immediately pulled her into the center of the fray, introducing her with grand, sweeping gestures, instantly drawing the attention of every major donor in his radius. I shifted my weight slightly, biting the inside of my cheek as a fresh wave of heat radiated down my lower back. My internal narration began tallying the receipts. I had paid for the open bar Travis was currently marching toward. I had signed the checks for the intricate branding displays Denise was proudly showing off. I legally owned the very floorboards Martin was standing on. Yet, I forced my expression to remain perfectly placid. I am not here to make a scene. I breathed the words out slowly. I am not here to make a scene. My gaze cut across the room and locked onto Nora Hale. Nora was not just my certified public accountant. She was the oldest and sharpest friend I had. She stood near the arched windows, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching the King family spectacle with cold, analytical eyes. When she looked at me, the air between us felt suddenly heavy. There was no wave, no polite smile, It was a brief, loaded glance that communicated volumes. We had spent the last 48 hours unearthing a terrifying financial reality, and her silent stare confirmed that the rot beneath our feet went much deeper than we had feared. I reached down and let my fingers graze the side of my handbag. Hidden inside the structured leather was a thick document sleeve. I traced the edge of it through the fabric of the bag, refusing to open it just yet. The mystery of what I was carrying was the only thing keeping me anchored. The physical weight of the papers was a reminder of the trap that was slowly closing around the people smiling in front of me. The event coordinator began moving through the room, politely signaling that the dinner portion of the evening was about to begin. I took a steadying breath and prepared to make the slow, agonizing walk to my reserved chair, but before I could take a single step, a subtle movement near the podium caught my eye. A man I did not recognize was standing in the shadows just behind the main stage. He was dressed impeccably in a dark, expensive suit, holding a lowball glass and watching the room with a proprietary gaze. I watched as Martin smoothly detached himself from a group of investors and glided over to the stranger. They spoke quietly, their body language entirely different from the jovial, open posture Martin used with the rest of the guests. This was a guarded, serious, and highly secretive exchange. My eyes dropped from their faces down to a small, unassuming high-top table pushed against the brick wall right beside them. Resting on the surface was a neat, thick stack of glossy presentation folders. The warm overhead light caught the silver foil lettering stamped across the top cover, Partnership Draft. The breath left my lungs in a slow, jagged exhale. The pain in my spine vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. If that chair had been the only thing they took from me, I would have stayed seated and smiled. 4 years ago, my life possessed a clean, predictable geometry. I was building a formidable reputation as a senior design strategist at Northline Spatial Group, a firm dedicated to the intersection of aesthetics and utility. My days were spent drafting blueprints, analyzing foot traffic patterns, and creating accessible retail and event spaces for high-end corporate clients. I understood how to construct environments that felt both beautiful and secure. I made my living by imposing order onto empty air, ensuring every load-bearing wall was sound and every legal code was met. I thrived in a world defined by measurable facts and structural integrity, which made the chaotic collapse of my family's livelihood all the more jarring to witness. The decline of King Home Decor was not a sudden implosion, but a slow, agonizing bleed. My parents had built their boutique interior design business on charm, expensive lunches, and a booming local economy. But as trends shifted and their wealthy clientele aged out of major renovations, their profit margins vanished. They possessed impeccable taste, but an absolute refusal to acknowledge modern financial realities. They ignored the mounting debts, hid the past due notices, and continued to live as though their revenue was exactly what it had been a decade prior. When the threat of bankruptcy finally became unavoidable, the panic that set in was not about losing their livelihood, it was about losing their social standing. The prospect of bad publicity, of their country club friends whispering about their failure, terrified them far more than actual poverty. I stepped in quietly, exactly as I had been conditioned to do my entire life. I wanted to protect them from the public humiliation they feared so deeply. But I also wanted to protect myself from the emotional fallout of their ruin, using the capital I had carefully saved for my own career. I formed a private limited liability company. Through that protective corporate shell, I purchased a massive, neglected warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. It was an absolute wreck, a cavernous space filled with cracked concrete and the smell of rot. But the bones of the building were solid. It was the perfect blank canvas to house their remaining inventory and serve as a new, scaled-down showroom that could double as a boutique retail space. I did not simply hand them the keys. I knew my parents' history with money, so I treated the rescue operation with the same rigorous professionalism I applied to my corporate clients. I leased the entire ground floor to them at a deep discount, asking for a fraction of the fair market value. But in exchange for that financial mercy, I required them to sign a formal, ironclad commercial lease. I sat across from them at a polished conference table and watched them sign a document that included crystal-clear, non-negotiable clauses. The contract explicitly outlined the discounted rent schedule. It strictly defined the permitted use of the space as a retail showroom only. It set hard occupancy limits to comply with fire codes. Most importantly, it contained an absolute prohibition against any form of subleasing or third-party event hosting without my express, written authorization. Once the legal boundaries were set, I opened my checkbook again to make the building habitable. I single-handedly funded a massive, grueling renovation. I paid contractors to tear out the unsafe floors and pour new, polished concrete. I financed the installation of brand-new heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. I oversaw the construction of fully compliant, accessible restrooms. I brought in specialized lighting grids to highlight their furniture displays, and I covered the exorbitant costs of the commercial property insurance upgrades required to open the doors to the public. I poured my money, my expertise, and my exhausting labor into the foundation of their second chance, almost the moment the paint dried. The narrative was rewritten. Denise was a master of revisionist history. Within weeks of the grand opening, she began spinning a heroic tale to her friends, her clients, and the local business community. She framed the move not as a desperate bailout funded by her daughter, but as a brilliant, strategic pivot. She proudly retold the story of how she and my father had weathered a tough economic season and bravely saved the family business themselves through sheer determination. My name was never once mentioned as the financier. I was never acknowledged as the landlord or the project manager. I was entirely erased from the equation. And I let it happen. I convinced myself that their pride was a small price to pay for family peace. This dynamic of subsidized delusion extended far beyond my parents. My younger brother, Travis, had spent his entire adult life floating aimlessly in and out of entry-level jobs. He would get hired on a burst of superficial charm, last perhaps 8 or 9 months, and then quit because he felt disrespected, or get fired for chronic absenteeism. Whenever he stumbled, Denise was there, armed with excuses and a safety net. She constantly diverted resources to cover his rent or his car payments, framing every single bailout as temporary help for family. He was the golden boy who could do no wrong, forever protected from the consequences of his own profound laziness. Martin, meanwhile, perfected the art of the quiet enabler. He played the role of the gentle peacemaker, navigating the family tension by avoiding it entirely, behind closed doors, away from his wife and son. He would occasionally pull me aside. He would pat my shoulder, look at me with weary eyes, and thank me privately for keeping the ship afloat. But he never possessed the spine to correct Denise in public. When she stood in the middle of the showroom I bought, under the lights I paid for, and minimized my contributions to a room full of people, Martin would just smile benignly and sip his drink. His private gratitude was supposed to be enough to sustain me. I kept helping them because of a fundamental flaw in my own logic. I truly believed that structure and generosity could eventually stabilize their chaos. I thought that if I provided a solid enough foundation, a beautiful space, and a clear set of rules, they would eventually learn how to stand on their own. I thought patience was the same thing as love. My accountant and oldest friend, Nora Hale, saw the reality long before I was willing to admit it. During a review of my limited liability company's tax filings, she sat across from my desk and pointed a pen at the heavily subsidized rent figures. She warned me, in a tone devoid of any sympathy, that informal family gratitude is not the same thing as legal protection. She told me that people who refuse to respect you will eventually refuse to respect your boundaries. I dismissed her concerns. I pointed to the signed commercial lease in my filing cabinet and argued that I had avoided the messy emotional conflict by securing the business side of things. I was wrong. The lease was a piece of paper, and I was dealing with people who only respected power. Looking back at those 4 years, the truth was stark and undeniable. Despite funding the rescue, managing the property, and carrying the financial risk, I was never once treated like the owner of the building. I was only ever treated like the designated safety net, the person expected to quietly fix every disaster, absorb every cost, and remain conveniently invisible while they took all the credit. The pop in my lower back sounded like a thick, dry branch snapping in a completely quiet forest. I was at a client site, stepping awkwardly off a small platform while helping a contractor maneuver a set of heavy, solid wood acoustic panels. The pain was not a gradual build. It was an immediate, blinding, white-hot spike that dropped me straight to the concrete floor and stole the breath completely from my lungs. Within 48 hours, I was lying face down on a sterile operating table having a severely ruptured lumbar disc surgically repaired. Waking up in the recovery ward was a disorienting haze of fluorescent lights, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, and the heavy, dull, relentless ache of deep tissue trauma. The orthopedic surgeon stood at the foot of my bed the morning after the procedure, his expression entirely devoid of bedside manner. He delivered a blunt, non-negotiable warning regarding my future. There would be absolutely no prolonged standing. There would be no twisting motions. There was zero room for pushing through the pain. He looked me dead in the eye and stated that if I wanted to guarantee my long-term mobility and achieve a full recovery, my life for the next 2 months was restricted to lying flat, walking short, closely monitored distances, and wearing a rigid, restrictive brace at all times. The anesthesia was barely out of my system, my mind still thick and slow, when my cell phone vibrated violently against the plastic tray table next to my bed. The caller ID flashed Denise. I answered, my throat still raw and scratchy from the surgical breathing tube, expecting the panicked, worried tone of a mother whose daughter had just undergone major spinal surgery. Instead, her voice was brisk, clipped, and entirely focused on logistics. She did not ask how the operation went. She did not ask about my pain levels or my prognosis. Her very first, breathless question was whether the upcoming anniversary and rebrand gala was still on track. She spoke in a rapid-fire pace, telling me the premium invitations had already circulated and the high-net-worth donors had already said yes. She heavily implied that my medical emergency was an incredibly poorly timed, selfish inconvenience that threatened to embarrass the family. I closed my eyes. The phone pressed hard to my ear and let the familiar, suffocating weight of lifelong obligation wash over me. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I agreed to run the entire event remotely from my house. I did it half out of a warped, deeply ingrained sense of duty, and half out of the paralyzing fear that if I canceled it, they would blame me for the total collapse of their public image and never let me forget it. My physical recovery quickly devolved into a surreal, high-stress collision of agonizing pain and high-level event management. My command center was my mattress. My daily routine was strictly dictated by a heavy medication schedule and the relentless, necessary heat of an electric pad pressed against my healing spine. From flat on my back, staring at the ceiling, I coordinated every logistical nightmare of a massive gala. I managed the high-end catering vendors, approved the final glossy branding mock-ups, and directed the complicated floral installations via endless video calls. I meticulously mapped out the guest list flow to prevent bottlenecks at the entrance and designed the sponsor signage, all while fighting desperately through the heavy mental fog of prescription muscle relaxants. As the date of the event approached, the pressure from my family multiplied exponentially. Martin began calling me with a barrage of last-minute demands, acting as though I were a perfectly healthy, well-rested event planner sitting comfortably in a corporate office rather than a surgical patient confined to a bed. He insisted on adding a tiered, exclusive seating section, which required me to completely redraw the master floor plan and negotiate with the rental company for different tables. He demanded an upgraded, imported wine service that blew right past the original budget I had set, and he casually requested a fully edited, professional video tribute to the family legacy to be played during dinner. During those lengthy phone calls, he never once paused to ask how I was coping physically. He simply listed his requirements, waited for my confirmation, and hung up. Travis, predictably, contributed absolutely nothing of substance to the actual work. Yet, He made sure to insert himself into every group email and planning thread. He bombarded my inbox with messages promising that he was bringing in a serious investor crowd. He demanded extra VIP tickets and premium table placement for people he refused to name, insisting that his networking was going to elevate the entire brand. He wanted the prestige of hosting without lifting a single finger to organize it. The sheer strain of managing their egos was exhausting, but the real, terrifying crack in the foundation appeared roughly 14 days before the event. Nora called me late one Tuesday afternoon. Her tone lacked her usual sharp, dry wit. She sounded cautious, almost hesitant. She had been meticulously reviewing the business side of the gala preparations, tracking the invoices and receipts I had forwarded to her office. She asked me, choosing her words very carefully, if my parents had somehow gained access to my company reserves or the vendor escrow funds. She had noticed highly irregular payment timing across the board. The initial deposits for the caterers had cleared days late, triggering penalty fees. Checks written to the lighting technicians were bouncing between different accounts in ways that made no logical accounting sense. The numbers clearing the bank were not lining up with the budgets I had painstakingly built and funded. A cold, hard knot formed tight beneath my ribs, distinct and entirely separate from the surgical pain radiating down my back, but I was so physically depleted, so desperate to just get through the next 2 weeks, that I actively chose to put blinders on. I brushed off Nora's concerns with a forced lightness in my voice. I told her there was probably just a banking delay. A holiday weekend holdup, or a simple misunderstanding with the merchant services processor. I promised myself, and I promised her, that I would deal with the finances, the accounts, and the messy reality of what my parents might be doing immediately after the gala concluded. I just needed to survive the night. I just wanted one peaceful, successful evening where they got their applause, the donors were happy, and I finally got to turn off my phone and rest. I convinced myself that ignoring the red flags and keeping the peace for just a few more days would not cost me anything I could not eventually afford. The phone rang at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was adjusting the heat settings on my lumbar pad when Nora's name illuminated my screen. We had spoken less than 48 hours prior, when I had foolishly brushed off her initial warnings about irregular payment timings. This call felt fundamentally different. The silence on the line before she spoke was heavy, stripped of our usual casual banter. She asked for explicit, unrestricted permission to review the master statements tied directly to my limited liability company's operating account, along with the raw property expense ledgers. She did not phrase it as a suggestion. It was a professional imperative. I swallowed the rising panic in my throat, opened my laptop, and granted her administrative access. For the next 2 hours, we sat on a silent, shared screen connection, watching a terrifying narrative unfold in black and white spreadsheet rows. The financial architecture I had built was being systematically hollowed out. First, Nora highlighted the property insurance premiums. A payment of $4,500 was marked severely delinquent, delayed by 21 days, putting the entire commercial policy at risk of cancellation. Then came the unexplained cash withdrawals. $200 here, $600 there, pulled directly from the operational reserves with no corresponding receipts. Most sickening were the vendor deposits. I stared at a line item for $3,000 clearly labeled for the primary event caterer. The money had left my account, but Nora confirmed it had never reached the vendor's banking portal. It had vanished into a blind transfer. My eyes burned as I scrolled further down. A specific, peculiar charge leaped off the screen. It was an invoice for $850 paid to a private, industrial cleaning crew. I had never hired this company. I clicked the attached digital receipt and read the timestamp. The crew had billed for 5 hours of deep sanitation, arriving at 2 in the morning on a Sunday, according to the strict operational hours I had mandated. The building was always dark and locked by 8 in the evening on weekends. There was absolutely no legitimate reason a private crew needed to scrub the floors in the middle of the night unless a massive, unsanctioned mess had been made. The paper trail grew darker. Nora flagged a cluster of recurring outbound transfers processed through a secondary, low-tier local payment gateway. The amounts were highly specific: $1,200, then $850, then $2,300. The recipient account was shielded, but the gateway itself was notorious in our city for handling high-risk transactions. Nora, whose forensic accounting skills were unmatched, cross-referenced the vendor identification and matched it to a holding company owned by one of Travis's known associates. It was the same group of men who ran aggressive, underground poker rings in the warehouse district. My blood ran cold. The narrative seemed obvious. Travis was stealing. He had somehow bypassed the security protocols, skimmed the event funds to cover his gambling debts, and used the warehouse for an after-hours game. I prepared myself to call him, to scream until my lungs gave out. But Nora stopped me. Her cursor hovered over the digital authorization column. To execute these specific wire transfers, the bank required two-factor approval. I watched, my stomach dropping into a bottomless freefall, as the authorization logs loaded. The approval codes had not been routed to my brother's phone. They had been manually accepted via a secure email link. The address belonged to Denise. A second, larger transfer, the one that drained the caterer's deposit, had been approved from a static internet protocol address. Nora ran the numbers. It was the exact address tied to Martin's home office router. They knew. They were not just covering for Travis. They were actively facilitating the theft, utilizing my assets as their personal, unregulated casino bank. I opened a new tab, my fingers stiff and clumsy, and pulled up the master lease compliance records. The structural layout of the warehouse included a massive upstairs mezzanine, accessible only via a locked industrial staircase. In the contract, I had legally restricted that specific square footage to static storage and basic showroom staging. It lacked the fire exits and reinforced railing required for a public gathering space. Yet, when I checked the utility sub-metering data for the past 30 days, the electricity usage for the mezzanine level was spiking astronomically between the hours of 10 at night and 3 in the morning. They were not just hosting a secret poker game, they were operating a fully functioning, unauthorized underground event space in a structurally non-compliant zone. Suddenly, a seemingly innocuous text message I had received 5 days ago took on a terrifying new context. The owner of the neighboring auto body shop had messaged me to say hello, casually adding that the family business must be booming because he had seen at least a dozen luxury cars parked wrapping around the back alley at midnight on a Thursday. I had assumed he had his days mixed up. He had not. The hidden activity was real, it was frequent, and it was entirely illegal. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over Martin's contact name. A desperate, furious urge to confront them verbally clawed at my chest. I wanted to demand an explanation. I wanted them to hear the betrayal in my voice. Nora's voice cut through the computer speakers. Sharp and commanding, she ordered me to stop. She warned me that the second I confronted them without an ironclad, unassailable portfolio of proof, they would deny everything, close the loopholes, and spin a narrative making me look unstable. She instructed me to stay completely silent and start gathering the real weapons. I needed every invoice, every single security camera log, all digital access codes, and every piece of insurance communication I could download. I ended the screen share and closed my laptop. The silence of my bedroom was deafening. Despite the agonizing pain radiating from my healing spine, I forced myself out of bed. I walked slowly, stiffly, to the heavy oak filing cabinet in the corner of my home office. I bypassed the recent vendor files and reached all the way to the back of the bottom drawer. I pulled out the original, heavy leather binder. It was coated in a thin layer of dust. I had not opened it in 4 years, having naively believed that a signature from a parent was a bond of trust. I carried the heavy binder back to my desk, turned on the small brass reading lamp, and flipped past the title page. I found a bright yellow highlighter in my pen cup. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely uncap it. I turned to page 12, found the clauses on permitted use, financial transparency, and immediate default conditions, and began to press the neon ink firmly against the paper. The financial dissection Nora and I conducted over the next 72 hours morphed from a simple audit into a full-scale autopsy. We had already established that my parents were stealing from the operating funds to cover up my brother's messes. But the deeper we dug into the encrypted server logs and unrecorded cash deposits, the clearer it became that the missing rent was the least of my problems. They were not just surviving, they were profiteering. Nora isolated a hidden subfolder on the main store computer, accessed remotely. Inside were dozens of digital flyers advertising exclusive, invite-only VIP antique previews. The entry fee was strictly cash, ranging from $200 to $500 a head. These private showings occurred long after the official closing time, turning my carefully restricted retail space into an underground bazaar. Every single dollar of that generated income was pocketed, never once reported to my corporate entity or declared on the lease ledger. But the most dangerous piece of the puzzle belonged to Travis. While sifting through the sent mail folder of the general business account, I found a thread of emails my brother had sent to several prominent local event planners. He was actively pitching the warehouse as a future family-owned event destination. He promised them unfettered access to the upper mezzanine, boasted about upcoming structural expansions, and offered them a 20% discount on booking fees for the next calendar year. He was selling rights to a property he did not own, operating with a reckless, unearned authority that could only exist if my parents had explicitly told him the building was theirs to control. My chest tightened as I stumbled across another draft, this one authored by Denise. It was addressed to a commercial lender at a regional bank. In the body of the email, my mother requested preliminary terms for a massive equity loan, casually mentioning that the legal owner, her daughter, had already verbally agreed to a full refinance arrangement to free up capital for the family enterprise. I stared at the glowing screen, my vision blurring with absolute rage. I had never agreed to any such thing. I had never even entertained a conversation about refinancing. Then, Nora flagged a routing anomaly that made my blood run entirely cold. An attachment containing preliminary property title data had been forwarded from the business account to an external, corporate email address. The domain belonged to a local real estate title and escrow firm. The recipient was Brooke Lane. Travis was not just parading his new girlfriend around for social points. He was actively utilizing her professional inbox and her company's credibility to make his fabricated ownership claims look legitimate in front of potential investors. The sheer scale of the deception demanded immediate confrontation. I picked up my phone and called my father first, hoping to find a shred of the moral compass I used to believe he possessed. When he answered, his voice was thick with false warmth. I bypassed the pleasantries and confronted him directly about the diverted vendor funds and the cash events. For a fleeting second, the line went dead silent. Then, the facade cracked. In a hushed, tense whisper, Martin admitted that they only moved money around until things improved. He claimed they were just borrowing against future profits, but the moment I demanded he put that exact explanation into a formal email for my records, his tone shifted to ice, and he flatly refused, abruptly ending the call. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was Denise. She did not bother to deny the allegations. Instead, she immediately deployed the weapon she had honed over 3 decades' weaponized guilt. Her voice dripped with theatrical disappointment as she accused me of turning into a cold, heartless corporate drone. She told me I cared more about petty paperwork and legal technicalities than my own parents' survival. She tried to shame me into silence, painting my demand for basic honesty as an act of profound familial betrayal. I hung up the phone, the silence of my room pressing in on me, and realized that logic and family loyalty were no longer applicable. I needed a mercenary. I scheduled an emergency, secure video consultation with Elias Ward, the fiercely pragmatic commercial real estate attorney who had originally drafted my limited liability company's charter. I uploaded the lease, the unrecorded cash ledgers, the unauthorized event flyers, and the draft email regarding the fraudulent refinance. Elias reviewed the documents with a terrifying clinical speed. When he finally looked at the camera, His expression was grim but resolute. He assured me that the commercial lease I held was incredibly strong, completely ironclad against their specific violations. However, he delivered a sharp, necessary reality check. The contract was only as powerful as the person enforcing it. He told me I had to immediately stop acting like a wounded daughter and start operating exclusively as a hostile property owner. Elias strictly advised against any further emotional, screaming phone calls. Anger was a liability. Documentation was power. He recommended initiating a formal, legally binding default path, but he also issued a chilling warning. He had seen this exact dynamic play out in 100 different family disputes. He promised me that the moment Denise realized she could no longer control me with guilt, she would pivot to character assassination. He warned me that she would almost certainly launch a preemptive smear campaign, attempting to discredit my mental state to their entire social circle before I ever had the chance to reveal the financial truth. I ended the call with Elias feeling a strange, hollow sense of calm. The betrayal was absolute, but so was my path forward. I spent the next 4 hours printing every piece of evidence. I printed the original commercial lease, the signed amendment pages, the digital access logs proving the after-hours entries, and the formal draft of the default notice Elias had rushed over to my inbox. I took a sleek, heavy black leather document sleeve from my desk drawer. I carefully stacked the papers inside, smoothing down the edges, and zipped it shut. I placed the sleeve gently into my largest handbag. I was not going to cancel the upcoming gala. I was going to attend it. I was going to let them stand on my floors, drink my wine, and finalize their traps. I committed to finishing the event, waiting for the exact moment they felt most untouchable. Before making my move, the shift in the family dynamic did not happen all at once. It was a slow, suffocating tightening of the social atmosphere in the 7 days leading up to the gala. My aunts, uncles, and extended cousins began treating me as if I were made of highly volatile glass. The group text messages, usually chaotic and loud, shifted to overly gentle, cautious check-ins when my aunt called on a Tuesday afternoon. Her tone was thick with a patronizing sympathy that made my skin crawl. She did not ask about the event logistics or the venue layout. She asked, in a hushed, breathy voice, if I was managing my emotional state okay given the heavy prescriptions. The source of this sudden, collective caution became crystal clear when my cousin Vivian Cole showed up at my front door on Thursday morning. Vivian was the only relative who operated outside my mother's sphere of influence. She walked into my kitchen, poured herself a cup of coffee, and delivered the warning with zero sugarcoating. Denise had spent the last 2 weeks systematically calling every branch of the family tree. Under the guise of maternal concern, my mother had been planting seeds of profound doubt. She told everyone that the spinal surgery had taken a severe mental toll on me. She whispered that I was not myself, that I was isolated, paranoid, and heavily reliant on strong painkillers. It was a masterclass in preemptive character assassination. Denise was framing my physical pain and my recent emotional distance as clinical instability. She was building a perfectly insulated narrative so that if I dared to stand up at the gala and mention stolen money, forged emails, or lease violations, the entire room would look at me with pity rather than belief. They would just shake their heads, blame the medication, and usher me out the back door. I also learned exactly how deeply the delusion had set into my brother. Vivian recounted a dinner she had attended with Travis and Brooke Lane just 3 nights prior. Brooke had apparently expressed some quiet hesitation about the scale of the upcoming announcements, asking if I, the person whose name was actually on the property records, was fully aligned with the vision. Travis had laughed her off. He told his new girlfriend that I was dramatic, but entirely harmless, a minor obstacle easily managed by the family. He then looked Brooke dead in the eye and assured her that the warehouse was basically the family's property now. He was not just lying to impress a woman, he had actually consumed his own fabricated reality. He believed his own con. The psychological warfare was infuriating. But the logistical maneuvers were what finally escalated the situation from a family dispute to a corporate ambush. On Friday morning, exactly 24 hours before the doors were scheduled to open. The lead staging vendor called me for a final layout approval. He casually mentioned a last-minute addition my father had requested. Martin had ordered a small, polished mahogany signing table to be placed directly adjacent to the main stage, set to be brought out right after the dessert service. When the vendor asked what it was for, Martin had smoothly claimed it was for processing high-level donor pledge documents. I knew my father. He did not care about donor pledges enough to interrupt a gala dinner for them. He cared about spectacle. My suspicions solidified into concrete panic an hour later when Nora called. She had been continuously monitoring the shared business calendar, looking for any newly created digital trails. She found a masked, same-day calendar entry scheduled for 9 o'clock on the night of the gala. The title was a single, terrifying line, Bridge Capital Introduction, Kings/Lane/M, King. The pieces slammed together with sickening clarity. Bridge Capital was a notoriously aggressive regional private equity firm. The inclusion of Brooke Lane's last name confirmed she was being used as the legitimate title and escrow conduit. They were not just hosting a party to celebrate their survival. They were using the gala, the crowd, and the perceived success of the warehouse to publicly push through a massive, unauthorized financial partnership. They intended to leverage my property right in front of my face. I immediately conferenced Elias Ward into the call. The attorney listened to the timeline, the discovery of the signing table, and the calendar entry. I expected him to tell me to shut the event down, to lock the doors and call the police. Instead, his advice was chillingly strategic. Elias explained that this escalation changed the entire legal landscape. If my parents and brother were attempting to use a highly publicized event to secure financing or a partnership using blatantly false ownership assumptions, then having a room full of high-net-worth witnesses was no longer a liability, it was an asset. If I canceled the gala now, they would simply retreat into the shadows, claim a misunderstanding, and continue bleeding me dry while spinning the narrative that I was crazy. But if I let them step onto the stage and attempt to execute a fraudulent contract in front of a private equity representative, the trap would snap shut on them in a highly public, undeniable way. Elias told me to let them reveal their entire strategy. I had to wait until the exact moment when denial became absolutely impossible. And then, I had to drop the hammer. Instead of canceling the caterers or changing the locks, I spent the rest of Friday afternoon preparing for a war I never wanted to fight. I stood at my desk, the rigid plastic of my lumbar brace biting into my ribs, and laid out the ammunition. I took the original, heavily highlighted commercial lease. I added the stack of printed digital access logs and the undeniable bank routing records Nora had compiled. I included a formally drafted, signed statement from Nora outlining the exact nature of the financial diversion. Beside it, I placed the clean, legally binding default notice Elias had prepared. Finally, I printed one pristine, unblemished copy of the original permitted use clause, the very paragraph they were about to violate on a massive scale. I packed every single document into the heavy leather sleeve. I zipped it closed. The sound loud and final in the quiet of my office. I was ready to attend the gala. I arrived at the venue at precisely 6 in the evening, well before the valet barricades were even positioned in the front lot. Walking through the main doors, I was struck by the polished elegance of the space. Every detail I had meticulously coordinated from my recovery bed had materialized perfectly. The lighting was curated to cast a soft, flattering glow across the polished concrete floors. A massive sponsor wall, featuring laser-cut brushed steel lettering, dominated the foyer. Near the coat check, a seamless tribute reel projected onto a sheer silk screen, displaying a carefully edited history of the family brand. It was a masterpiece of staging, and I had orchestrated every single second of it. My first priority was securing my physical boundaries. I navigated the empty floor, moving carefully in my rigid brace, until I reached the front row of seating, placed exactly where I had requested. Right beside the brass support rails of the main stage was my ergonomic chair. A thick piece of white cardstock was taped neatly to the backrest. Reserved, S. King, Seeing it gave me a fleeting sense of relief. It was my designated anchor for the night. By 7:15, the room was buzzing with the low, steady hum of wealth and influence. I watched from a quiet corner near the floral displays as Travis made his entrance. He was practically vibrating with manic energy, loudly greeting local politicians and business owners. Brooke Lane walked beside him, but her body language was entirely different from his. She looked visibly nervous, her shoulders tight, offering polite, constrained smiles to the people Travis introduced her to. She lacked the aggressive arrogance my brother wore like a uniform. Watching her cautiously sip sparkling water, I realized she might genuinely be in the dark about the exact nature of the trap Travis was leading her into. She was a prop, an unexpected witness to a fraud she likely believed was a legitimate business deal. Travis leaned into a group of 4 men near the bar, slapping one on the back and loudly promising that there were huge things coming for the venue. On the other side of the room, my parents were executing their respective strategies. Denise was overplaying the role of the perfect hostess, her laughter cutting through the jazz music, her hands constantly touching the arms of wealthy donor spouses. Martin, however, was failing to mask his anxiety. He kept pulling back his cuff to check his gold watch. He spent the better part of an hour huddled near the velvet ropes with Calvin Mercer. Mercer was a heavy-set, formidable man who ran a prominent local private equity firm. The two of them spoke in hushed, urgent tones, their heads bent together like conspirators. I decided to do a final sweep of the podium area before the speeches began. As I approached the small mahogany signing table Martin had covertly ordered, I noticed a glossy presentation folder resting on the surface. The cover was flipped open, left unattended for just a fraction of a second. I glanced down and felt the air stall in my lungs. It was a high-resolution architectural rendering. The bold text across the top read, "Mezzanine Expansion Phase 1." The image depicted the structurally restricted upper level, transformed into a fully operational, tiered viewing balcony with a permanent wet bar and reinforced seating. It was a visual map of a massive lease violation, printed in full color and ready to be shown to Calvin Mercer. I stepped back just as Vivian Cole materialized beside me. She leaned in close, her eyes scanning the crowd. She confirmed my worst fears. Denise had already been working the room. Vivian whispered that my mother had cornered the mayor's wife and 2 key charity board members near the entrance. Denise had shaken her head sadly, sighing about how heavy my pain medications were and how I was prone to emotional outbursts since the surgery. She was salting the earth, ensuring that if I caused a scene, my credibility would already be entirely compromised. Instead of letting the anger show, I weaponized my own behavior. I knew I was being watched, so I put on a masterclass in composed, lucid grace. I walked deliberately through the most crowded sections of the showroom. I spoke warmly to the guests, recalling specific details about their businesses and families. When a catering tray was offered to me, I politely declined the champagne, gesturing lightly to my back brace with a calm, self-deprecating smile. I told them loudly and clearly that I was following my surgeon's strict orders to the letter, prioritizing discipline over celebration. I made sure multiple influential people saw me moving carefully, speaking sharply, and maintaining absolute sobriety. I was actively, visibly dismantling my mother's fabricated narrative with every handshake. At 8 o'clock sharp, the soft chimes echoed over the speaker system, and the event coordinator politely asked the guests to begin finding their assigned tables for the dinner service. The low hum of conversation shifted as people began moving toward the center of the room. I took a deep breath, clutching the heavy leather sleeve inside my bag, and began my slow walk toward the front row. The pain in my lower spine was a dull, throbbing rhythm, but I focused on the visual anchor of my reserved seat. As I navigated past a group of lingering guests, the crowd parted just enough for me to see the staging area clearly. A young catering assistant was standing right next to my ergonomic chair. He was not acting on his own initiative. Denise was standing less than 2 feet away from him, her hand gripping his shoulder, her mouth moving in a sharp, urgent command. I froze mid-step and watched as the young man reached down, physically ripped the white reserve tag off the back of my chair, and began wheeling my only designated seat away into the dark shadows behind the curtain. I closed the distance between myself and the head table just as my mother smoothly intercepted my path. Denise placed a manicured hand lightly on my forearm, her grip surprisingly tight, and physically redirected me away from the front row. She leaned in, her voice a hushed, urgent whisper masked by a brilliant, artificial smile directed at the surrounding room. She told me I needed to step aside for just 1 minute. She claimed the event photographer needed to capture the primary family investors seated together for a magazine spread, and it was a matter of crucial guest optics. Before I could process the sheer audacity of the request, I watched my brother guide Brooke Lane directly into the empty space where my specialized seating had been. A standard, rigid banquet chair had been hastily shoved into the gap, and my ergonomic chair was nowhere to be seen. I kept my voice dangerously low, acutely aware of the wealthy donors milling just 2 feet away. I quietly reminded my mother about the strict medical restrictions my surgeon had mandated, emphasizing that I physically could not stand unsupported through the opening remarks. I expected a fleeting moment of maternal guilt. Instead, Martin stepped up behind her, adjusting his silk tie with absolute nonchalance. He dismissed my warning entirely. He told me it was a minor, temporary inconvenience and urged me to just be flexible for the sake of the evening. Travis, overhearing the exchange, did not miss the opportunity to perform for the small audience of guests gathering near the bar. He let out a loud, theatrical sigh and rolled his eyes. He announced to the immediate vicinity that I was perfectly fine and simply loved playing the martyr whenever the attention shifted away from me. The public disrespect was casual, practiced, and entirely devastating. Several guests offered polite, uncomfortable chuckles, effectively validating my brother's cruel narrative and deepening the humiliation. I stood frozen, the heavy plastic edges of my lumbar brace biting viciously into my ribs. Brooke Lane, seated in the center of the crossfire, looked profoundly uncomfortable. She leaned awkwardly out of her chair, her eyes wide with genuine confusion, and whispered up to me. She apologized frantically, explaining that Travis had explicitly told her I had personally offered up my seat because I preferred to mingle near the back of the room. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The lie machine was not just a single, unified effort. It was running on multiple tracks simultaneously, custom-built to manipulate every single person in the room based on what they needed to hear. Travis had lied to Brooke to make himself look like a generous host. Denise had lied to the guests to make me look unstable. Martin was lying to Calvin Mercer to secure a fraudulent fortune. I remained standing. The dull ache in my lower spine rapidly intensified into a sharp, blinding heat that radiated down my legs. I forced my posture to remain perfectly straight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me buckle. From my vantage point against the brass support rail, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the head table. I watched Denise accept glowing praise from the mayor regarding the stunning floral installations and the flawless event flow. She pressed a hand to her chest, feigning humble gratitude for an evening she did not organize, funded by a bank account she was actively draining. Every second I spent standing there in agony, watching them bask in my stolen efforts, stripped away the last remaining shreds of my familial loyalty. My resolve calcified into something cold and absolute. A young catering manager suddenly broke through the crowd, looking panicked and holding a thick leather-bound presentation folder. He scanned the front area, his eyes darting between the empty podium and the occupied head table. He caught my eye and hurried over, asking in a hushed tone where he was supposed to place the documents for the signing ceremony. Without waiting for my answer, he accidentally set the heavy folder down on the small cocktail table directly beside me while he reached for his two-way radio. The cover page was exposed for exactly 5 seconds, but 5 seconds was all I needed. The bold, embossed heading read, Mercer Bridge Capital. Beneath it was a detailed summary of terms for a massive equity partnership. My eyes scanned the bullet points with ruthless speed. I saw the phrase operator control explicitly assigned to Martin King. I saw a legally binding guarantee of family-held premises rights, falsely asserting that the King family possessed the unencumbered authority to leverage the commercial property as collateral. It was the ultimate confirmation. They were not just pitching a vague concept, they had drafted the actual paperwork. They intended to execute a fraudulent commercial contract, using my building as the primary asset. Right here in the middle of the gala. The overwhelming urge to snatch the folder, march up to the microphone, and scream the truth into the sound system was almost blinding. But Elias Ward's warning echoed clearly in my mind. Premature emotional confrontation was a massive legal liability. I needed them to commit entirely before I sprang the trap. I carefully stepped away from the cocktail table, pulled my phone from my clutch, and opened my encrypted message thread with Nora and Elias. My fingers were stiff, but my mind was operating with crystalline precision. I typed a single, definitive message. They are using the gala for a deal. Move now. I hit send and slid the phone back into my bag. A fresh, vicious spike of pain tore through my lumbar spine, forcing me to grip the edge of the brass rail for support. I reached my other hand deep into my bag and let my fingers wrap tightly around the thick, textured leather of my document sleeve. The physical weight of the lease, the bank records, and the default notice anchored me to the floor. I looked at my parents, smiling and shaking hands, utterly convinced of their own invincibility. I decided right then that I would absolutely not sit quietly in a corner, literally or legally. Dinner service was underway, the clatter of silver against porcelain echoing under the vaulted ceilings. I remained standing near the edge of the staging area, my back radiating a constant, dull heat. The dessert plates were being cleared when Martin tapped his spoon against his crystal wine glass. The room fell into a polite hush. He stepped up to the microphone, his chest puffed out with artificial pride. He launched into a grand, sweeping monologue about the resilience of the King family brand. Then, he turned his gaze to my brother. He publicly praised Travis, claiming he had truly stepped up this past year. He told the room that Travis was the future of the company, the driving force behind a brand new partnership that was going to secure the family legacy for generations. Denise took the microphone next. She was glowing, soaking in the applause. She thanked the major donors by name. She thanked the florists, the caterers, and the jazz trio. Then, almost as an afterthought, she waved a dismissive hand in my general direction. She offered a saccharine smile and thanked me for helping out a little bit from bed while recovering. The phrasing was a calculated, deliberate erasure of the thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours I had poured into saving them. From the middle of the room, a chair scraped loudly against the concrete. My cousin Vivian stood up. She did not have a microphone, but her voice carried perfectly. She asked, her tone razor-sharp, who exactly paid for the event, and more importantly, who actually owned the building they were all standing in. The air in the room instantly shifted. The polite smiles froze. Travis, sensing the loss of control, panicked. He grabbed Brooke Lane by the elbow and tried to shove her toward the microphone, attempting to use her professional presence as a human shield and social proof, but Brooke dug her heels in. She looked at the glossy presentation folders stacked nearby, then looked at my pale, sweating face, and she refused to move. Denise scrambled to regain the floor. She signaled frantically to a catering supervisor and pointed directly at the empty space where my ergonomic chair had originally been. She commanded the staff member to move any remaining seating out of that corner completely, claiming the photographer needed a clear, wide-angle shot of the investors. She looked at me, her eyes dead and cold, and told me I could just stand by the wall for 10 minutes. I looked at her, and then I looked at the catering staff. I said no. I kept my voice perfectly even, but it carried. I stated that I was not moving, and I was not standing by the wall. Martin's face flushed a deep, furious red. He could not tolerate a public challenge to his authority, especially not with Calvin Mercer watching. He marched down from the podium, his voice dropping the charming host facade entirely. He stopped 2 feet in front of me and delivered the line that severed our relationship forever. He said, "It is just a chair. Sloan, you can stand. Do not be dramatic." The entire warehouse went dead silent. The jazz band had stopped playing. The cruelty was so naked, so utterly devoid of parental care, that even the wealthiest, most detached donors in the room recoiled. Denise let out a high, nervous laugh, instantly trying to smile it away as a misunderstood joke. She told everyone I was just tired, but the silence was shattered by Brooke. Her voice was shaking, but it was loud enough for the front tables to hear. She blurted out that Travis had explicitly told her I had already approved everything. She pointed a trembling finger at the presentation folders and said Travis promised I had legally cleared the property expansion language. I stared directly at Calvin Mercer, then at my brother. I announced to the entire room that I had never approved a single word of it. I unzipped the heavy leather sleeve I had been clutching. I pulled out a thick, meticulously organized document packet and dropped it heavily onto the mahogany signing table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I looked at my family and said, "Good. Let us talk about what I actually approved." I slammed my hand flat against the top of the stack. I pulled the original commercial lease from the top, the heavy paper crisp and undeniable. I fanned out the signed amendment pages alongside it, tapping my finger against the highlighted clauses covering permitted use, strict subleasing prohibitions, and insurance compliance. Every single signature belonged to Denise and Martin, binding them to my rules. I turned to my father, with the mayor, Calvin Mercer, Brooke, and 100 silent guests watching. I demanded he identify the legal owner of the warehouse. Martin opened his mouth, but no words came out. His eyes darted toward the exit. When he refused to answer, I turned back to the crowd. I stated clearly and loudly that my private limited liability company owned the building, the land, and every fixture inside it outright. Then, I started dismantling their entire operation. I listed the documented violations one by one. I exposed the unapproved, after-hours paid events. I detailed the thousands of dollars in cash income deliberately concealed from me. I revealed the illegal, unsafe misuse of the mezzanine space. Finally, I turned directly to Calvin Mercer and exposed the false representations my family had made to his financing contacts regarding operator control. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. Nora Hale strode down the center aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete, flanked by Elias Ward. Nora did not even pause for breath. She held up her own leather binder and verbally confirmed the entire accounting trail. She explained to the room, with ruthless precision, how funds legally tied to the property and legitimate vendor deposits had been systematically diverted through secondary payment processors directly connected to Travis and his gambling associates. Brooke Lane looked physically ill. She took 2 steps away from Travis, her hands trembling. She admitted out loud that Travis had convinced her I was fully on board with the corporate leverage. She confessed that he had manipulated her position in title processing to legitimize his fraudulent claims to Mercer's team. She looked Mercer dead in the eye and flatly refused to support or verify any aspect of the pending deal. Elias stepped forward, bypassing the social pleasantries entirely. He placed a formal, heavily stamped notice of default directly onto the mahogany table. He announced that he had already filed a temporary legal order preventing any financing, sublease, or property control agreement based on false authority while the formal dispute proceeded. Calvin Mercer was a shark, but he was a legally cautious shark. The moment he realized the ownership claims were completely fabricated and the entire gala was a staged theatrical production to manufacture credibility, he backed away. He buttoned his suit jacket, shot Martin a look of absolute disgust, and immediately walked out of the building. His legal team trailed right behind him. Denise panicked. She fell back on her only remaining weapon. She raised her voice, adopting a tone of hysterical, weeping concern, and yelled that I was on heavy medication for my surgery. She begged the guests not to listen to me, claiming I was having a paranoid episode. Vivian shut it down instantly. She stepped out of the crowd and loudly rejected the lie, stating that I had been perfectly consistent and sober all night. 2 other donor spouses chimed in, openly noting that Denise had been suspiciously planting those exact rumors all evening. The room saw right through the manipulation. The medication defense crumbled into dust. The final emotional blow was mine. I looked at the three of them. Stripped of their power and their audience, I told them I was completely done funding their lies. I formally announced the commencement of the lease termination proceedings, precisely following the contract default path they had signed. I gathered my documents, zipped the leather sleeve closed, and walked slowly toward the exit. My back was in agony, but my dignity was entirely intact, and the entire room was finally on my side. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift and absolute. My parents lost all legal control of the showroom and were forced to clear out their remaining inventory under the watchful eye of a private security firm. Travis disappeared from the business entirely, fleeing the city to avoid his mounting debts and the burned bridges. I reclaimed the warehouse, brought the building up to code, and successfully reopened it under a highly profitable, strictly vetted new tenant plan. I only kept one item from that terrible night. Sitting in a small frame on my office desk is the old, slightly torn white tag that reads, "Reserved." It is the perfect daily reminder that the night my family told me to stand was the very night I finally stood up for myself. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.